All right, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for everyone, our PAG members for joining us, as well as the members of the public who are tuning in. This is the 6th meeting of our project advisory group. And most of our agenda today is going to be going through more potential strategies for the county. And I'm going to bring up, share my screen. There we go. Well, I have some of this in the presentation. So in just a minute, we'll have Jenna go through our announcements. And then, like I said, we're going to spend most of our time going through strategies related to additional regulatory strategies, building off the conversation from our last meeting. And then also looking at funding option strategies. We'll after a presentation on those topics, we'll break out into small groups again. Based on our attendance today, it's looking like we'll probably break into 2 groups like we did last time and discuss those strategies. We'll also spend a little bit of time revisiting category A from our last meeting, since we didn't get as much time to cover that topic. Can you all see my screen right now? The presentation? Jenna?
Yeah, Steve, I can see it, but I don't see it in like presenter mode. Like I don't see the agenda that you're talking through. I just see it's on the first slide. I don't know if it's worth trying to
Yeah, let me try that again. There we go. Is that better? Okay, I clicked the wrong one. Let's see here. Okay, sorry about that. So we will break into small groups to discuss those strategies. We're also going to provide some time to go through category A, which didn't get as much time from our small group discussions at the last meeting. And then we'll come and report back and wrap things up after public comment. So that's our agenda for today. Jenna, why don't you go ahead with announcements?
All right, thanks. Hi, everyone. I am filling in for Jackie this month at the meeting. So we just wanted to thank everyone for being here today. We know there's a lot of competing priorities, especially in the summer, and we appreciate you prioritizing being here. We do know some folks have had some scheduling conflicts. So, just as a reminder, we think we'll get better feedback from you if you are attending the meetings and can talk to the other stakeholders here. We will strive to check in with you after meetings if you do miss one to see if you have any feedback to share, but of course think it'll be a richer, more robust conversation if you can talk with the other stakeholders about what you think. So that's just a friendly reminder about that. And then the other thing is probably in the next month or so, you'll see an email from us. Some commissions and committees at the county are moving to hybrid meetings where you can either be online or in person. So we will probably just pull the group to see where people's interest level is on that. So you can expect to see an email from us sometime in the next couple of weeks. And that's all I've got.
All right, any questions for Jenna at all at this time? All right, and I think everyone's doing this, but I'll just repeat, I appreciate for non-PAG members to mute themselves and turn off their videos. Just makes it easier for us to facilitate our PAG discussion. And of course, there is time on the agenda for public comment. I'd ask the same when we go into breakout groups. You'll all be included and be able to listen in to one of the 2 breakout groups. So appreciate your muting and turning videos off during that time. All right. With that, I'm just gonna briefly go over our process again. We talked about this last time. June through August, we are reviewing the strategies by category and type. So we started that last month. We're doing that this month, and then we'll have our final month of, or our final meeting in August of taking a look at these preliminary strategies. We will then in September do a round of community engagement, talking to Planning Commission, County Council, and other types of public engagement to let people, to reflect what we have been talking about throughout the summer. There will be no PAG meeting in September. Then we'll reconvene again in October and bring to you condensed, let's say, and probably repackaged set of priority strategies that we'll get our second bite at the apple and probably review those strategies and add more detail to them. So we'll do that in October, and then November we'll have another round of community engagement, and then meet one more time is the plan in December. We'll see if that works or if we might need to move to January, depending on other holiday and other conflicts. But our intent is to meet a final time in December to make final recommendations about strategies and also talk a little bit about implementation and monitoring. So that's where we're at. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Elizabeth Decker to lead us through a presentation about additional regulatory strategies. This is category B from the document we sent out. Elizabeth.
Yeah, good afternoon, Steve and PAG members. Thanks all for being here. Elizabeth Decker with Jet Planning to talk through some of these additional regulatory strategies that really fall under the code updates in the zoning code. So go ahead, Steve. So if it has to do with zoning code, you get to hear me talk about it. A and B are really sort of where we're focusing on that. So to distinguish what category B, what we're calling, uncreatively perhaps, the additional regulatory strategies, is this is really about changing the rules that apply to the housing that we've already identified some strategies in category A about how to expand those housing options, both the quantity and variety of units. And this is really sort of about tinkering with the rules that apply to that development once it's been permitted. So if you think of it, category A, remember, was about expanding the pie and making it bigger. And category B is kind of about digging into the recipes and tinkering, like, oh, do we need a little bit more flour, a little bit more butter? How do we make the crust flakier or more delicious or a juicier filling? That's really what we're doing with category B as applied to housing. So just like category A, a lot of these do primarily affect market rate units, the idea being to improve the feasibility and or quality of development. But there are some specific strategies we'll discuss that are code standards that would be specific to regulated affordable housing. So we get at that portion of the income spectrum to a degree as well. And then in category E that we're discussing today, we'll also talk about more strategies around affordability. So before we dive in, I also just wanted to preface, there are a lot of specifics, in the memo. We'll touch on some of them today. There's really just so much that we could do in the code. And I think our priorities that we're hoping to talk through with you today is really thinking about the promising areas where we want to drill down into some of the policy details, making sure that we understand the areas that are the highest priority, because there's a bigger issue there that could be addressed and that would have the most impact on expanding housing options. And then some of the nuances of exactly what the strategy winds up being. We're happy to hear your ideas, but there's more than we could possibly talk about in 10 meetings. So it's more just about the higher level, the priority areas and the biggest issues to solve, so that we can get those areas, and as Steve mentioned with the schedule, make sure that then we refine the policy specifics going forward. And we also really want to hear anything that's missing in this conversation with these regulatory strategies. This is informed in part by our code audit and our stakeholder interviews to help understand, like what other pie fillings would be really interesting to add to the zoning code. But if we've missed any, this is the time to make sure that those are part of the menu, so to speak. So go ahead. If you would please, Steve, next slide. So Steve mentioned we just want to recap. So remember, we're expanding the pie to get zoning permissions for both the more different types of housing and more total units. These are the 7 different strategy areas that we identified, reducing minimum lot sizes. We've also talked sort of in between the meetings about there could be an additional option here that isn't middle housing per se, but that's a small lot infill option to create smaller lots for single family detached housing, but that's an alternative to the base zone. So we're adding that in as we move forward. We're looking at increasing minimum density, revising some maximum densities to align with the minimum lot sizes, potentially upzoning some areas for more medium and high density housing. Increasing the where middle housing types are permitted, and then limiting some of the competing uses that are lower density, looking at bonus density, and then targeting the commercial zones, thinking about whether there are some opportunities there to expand the allowed residential uses. So we discussed this briefly. We're going to get into a little bit more detail in the breakout room, but just keep in mind this is the broad palette of ways that we've identified, some, certainly more promising than others based on last month's discussion, but this we haven't, we'll go back and refine in that next step. But as we continue iterating, next slide, please. As we get into category B, this is really about tinkering with the rules that apply to these new housing opportunities once we permit them through the code. So one of the biggest priority areas that we have that we're looking at is ways to reduce and adjust the off-street parking requirements. So this is a pretty broad topic in terms of ways to adjust parking. And we're looking at ways we can adjust parking that reduce both the number of minimum spaces that are required for various projects, as well as how that parking has to be configured. So for example, on single family and middle housing, are parking spaces allowed to be in tandem, like one behind the other, or do they each have to be separate, so wider rather than deeper? Things like that, those types of configuration questions can make a difference as to how it can fit on the site and what the project feasibility is like. So we're looking at ways, knowing that parking certainly introduces costs for new developments and uses some site area that possibly could be a trade-off in terms of how many housing units could be, fit on there. Are we going to fit parking or housing? We're looking at ways to address that, but definitely taking into account the community in which we're planning and the transportation needs of those residents. So we're aware that this, it's not so simple as just eliminating parking because there's a cost associated with it. It needs to get targeted in some different ways. So generally speaking, the 3 pathways that we looked at are some across the board reductions. So we could just, again, we could switch it all to 0 parking spaces or switch it all to 1 space per unit. So just across the board reductions. The second general option is more targeted by right reductions, meaning that they're permitted in the code specifically for a project, but that these targeted reductions would be more specific to certain project characteristics, such as based on the location where it's at, is it served by transit, is there a lot of on-street parking available, what are the resident characteristics like, and some other factors like that. And then the third pathway would be to have a more discretionary process where, projects come in and are sort of evaluated one by one on their own merits based on some of those same factors. And then it would just be about developing what makes sense. So there's some trade-offs with these 3 pathways. And generally, we think most of the strategies we're discussing are aimed at this middle option that we want to have some by right reductions, modifications to parking, but we want to keep them targeted to specific types of projects so that it wouldn't be all housing types. They're not large categories, they're smaller categories, but they're also not so individual project specific that it adds a lot of review time for both developers and complexity for the county staff in trying to determine what's fair or what's right. So we're generally aiming to this middle path. Oh, next slide, please. But we do want to hear some feedback from you if you think that we're heading in the right direction with those. Back one if you would. So thinking about off-street parking requirements, sort of the first grouping of ways to adjust the on-street parking minimums and the configurations has to do with these middle housing types we've been talking about. So duplexes, triplexes, and quadplexes, those are new uses. So getting some parking requirements that fit those. Looking at potentially reducing some parking requirements around narrow lots and townhouses, including the driveway spacing and access requirements. So that configuration piece for townhouses. And then also looking at cottage parking for cottage developments, and then ADU parking. There's already been some flexibility added to that with an option to use on-street parking credits for ADUs. And there are some statewide measures about eliminating ADU off-street parking if an ADU is located near transit. So that's a model that we could build on, as well as potentially looking to reduce ADU parking further. So those are sort of the middle housing parking issues. And the next one is one of the next, if you would. Yes. So then multifamily is probably where the parking issues are going to be the most significant. So we've been focusing a lot of effort on that. Currently, the multifamily residential parking is very straightforward, is the good news. It's 1.5 spaces per unit, regardless of any of these other characteristics we're talking about, like the size of the project, where it's located relative to transit or other transportation options, whether there's on-street parking available or not, what the resident population is, whether it's a regulated income restricted building, whether it's senior housing only, whether it's large families, whether the units are 5-bedroom or 1-bedroom, it's 1.5 space for all units. And so we were able to get some parking data showing these are apartment projects built in the last couple of years, and just showing that, we had heard a lot about it's very difficult to achieve high densities with the parking ratio. And so we wanted to ground truth that. Again, these are the projects that worked. These aren't the projects that didn't work. So we don't really have that data. But we do get to see, that not only are some projects, these projects that come forward able to meet that 1.5, the middle column, the parking ratio, shows that many of these projects are in fact exceeding the minimum parking. And that's a choice that they were able to both fit on their site and that they felt best met their future resident population and the parking needs and demands. So we're looking at how we can, to make some refinements to multifamily based on what we're seeing on the ground. Again, these numbers, the density numbers here were in the, more than the lower end of the high density, if that makes sense. So if you go to the next slide, Steve, please. Looking at some ways that we could add some refinements to that 1.5 spaces. So one of those could be, for example, the last bullet point for higher density projects. As they get over that 30 units, or maybe it's 35 or 40, again, we want to be a little more broad right now in our discussion. But as we get to that higher density, maybe that's where having some reductions to parking could be targeted and could be effective in achieving those higher densities. But we have come up with a list of potential ways that we could target multifamily parking changes. And the first one, I'd say, to a degree, it's sort of a mix and match of which ones the feedback we get about what's most promising and most appropriate for the community. But the first one I will point out is there are some new state legislative requirements about reducing minimums for projects near transit, including for affordable housing. So that one we will need to comply with, but some of these additional ones, we have flexibility at the county level to see how we implement. So go ahead, please, Steve.
Elizabeth, if you could look at the chat real quick. Mark had a question.
So I'm guessing you're thinking about those three sort of general pathways that I was describing up front. And absolutely, we want that to be part of the discussion. I think that as we go through these parking pieces, you'll see there's different pieces of these that fit within each of those three pathways. But primarily, we've aimed towards the middle path of those seem to be the strategies based on our initial research and our code audit, and some of this analysis of the site plans and recent development trends seems to be pointing us toward. Definitely, though, we are here as part of this discussion in our breakout groups to talk about, are there additional strategies potentially in those other pathways that we should be considering at this time. Okay, so the next cluster of strategies that we're looking at has to do with ground floor commercial requirements for mixed use developments, both in mixed use and commercial zones. So this pairs with the earlier strategy we were discussing about whether to permit more multifamily residential in commercial zones. Right now it's permitted, but only on upper stories. And we've heard that that can be challenging to develop any residential because of those ground floor retail or other commercial use requirements. So a few ways that we came up with to address this, potentially using some active ground floor uses that has to do with the design of the space and making sure that there's still active utilization of the area by residents, both physical design in terms of windows and doors and access, as well as activity areas. So there are people coming and going that fulfills some of the activation requirements and intent of ground floor retail. So that could be a way to substitute some or all of the ground floor retail if the retail and commercial environment is seeming saturated in certain areas. And the second one here is looking at, could there be different configurations of that retail and that, or the retail or commercial and the residential on the same site, so that, for example, they could be in separate buildings on the same site rather than stacked on top of each other. Okay, go ahead. And then one other piece that we heard, I believe this came through from the group, was looking at ways, you know, if we're not necessarily focusing on ground floor commercial and upper story residential, are there other ways to think about how we get neighborhood scale retail and services throughout residential areas? So rather than, you know, trying to focus on that ground floor retail. So a couple different strategies there. Go ahead. Then the next one, broad category, simplifying design standards. Thinking about throughout the code, you know, a lot of what the zoning code is saying not only what can you build and where, but what does it need to look like, both in terms of the site configurations and the individual buildings and architectural details. And so there could certainly be some balancing there and some revising about with these new middle housing types, as well as some higher density multifamily, how to make those developments fit into communities without increasing complexity and cost. So one strategy that's come through in our work so far is looking at ways to simplify some residential standards in the Highway 99 sub-area, while still respecting the overall design goals and form-based code that was developed for that area. But are there, you know, particularly around some of this middle housing, could there be some simplification? We've also heard a lot about, are there ways to revise and upgrade the cottage housing provisions to make them more useful? So there's a number of site and architectural details, design details there, such as the density that's allowed, whether the units can be attached or detached, how much open space, how the open space is configured, how the parking areas are configured, in addition to the, you know, which touches on that parking strategy in B1 we discussed. So a lot of work around cottages, based in part on the projects we've seen and frankly not seen come forward in the last couple of years under the current code. And then another piece that came through in the code audit was looking at the open space standards for larger multifamily projects. So similar to parking, once you get over, say, 30 units, or it might be a different number, but when you get up into the higher density, is there different ways does the open space need to continue to increase linearly with each new unit, or are there ways to set a maximum area and then, you know, work within that envelope, improving the quality of it, perhaps, so that the site area does not become a constraint? Next, please. And then we touched a little on the ADU standards in terms of parking, but looking at other ways to revise the ADU standards, the county has really gone really far in moving their ADU standards forward. So there are just a few further refinements that we've identified based on some best practices that would make these, you know, beyond, you know, platinum status rather than gold medal status. I guess they don't give out platinum medals at the Olympics, but they should. So if we wanted to go for platinum level, we could be looking at things like allowing 2 ADUs on a property rather than 1. That could look like 1 detached and 1 basement conversion, for example. The removing the parking requirements or further modifying them, as we discussed. There's also an option to increase the allowed ADU size for smaller dwellings. Right now it's a percentage of the size. And so if you have a smaller dwelling, you're somewhat penalized in terms of what size ADU you could build, even though hypothetically you have more lot area to do it upon. There's also some design standards around architectural compatibility that are somewhat discretionary and could be revised or modified. On the other end, thinking about increasing the allowed ADU size, we could also remove the minimum size. There's some debate about where that came from and if it's necessary, as well as looking at how ADUs are permitted with single family in the mixed use zone. It was something that came up from our current planning staff. So go ahead. And then looking at, somewhat related to, potentially related to ADUs, but distinct, is looking at how manufactured homes and tiny homes could be used throughout the community, both on individual residential lots, either as a primary dwelling or as an ADU, and within community park settings. So that applies to both manufactured home parks as well as tiny homes that could be either within, potentially an RV park or a manufactured home park or some other type of tiny home village or community that we think through. So first strategy here is that existing manufactured home parks are one of the primary sources of market rate affordable housing for lower income groups in the county as well as statewide. And so looking at ways to protect those existing homes and protect the residents from displacement. So some tools there, both zoning and non-regulatory as well. And then thinking about some opportunities for tiny homes that can overlap with RVs, whether that's again, in park settings or individually. So go ahead. Our last strategy here talks about transportation improvement standards. And so this is similar to parking in the sense that transportation improvements are necessary to serve new development. We need roads, we need access, we need pedestrian and bicycle connections to get where we're going, both to serve a specific development and to build out the robust county network. However, the costs can be high, particularly as a percentage on some of these smaller projects. So, a full update and review of the transportation improvement standards could be a standalone project in and of itself. And so that's not necessarily what we're proposing through this strategy, but we did have an opportunity to talk with development engineering and public works staff, also keeping in mind fire access and safety requirements, and two, specific, somewhat narrow standards that came up as areas of interest. We're looking at some of the cross circulation requirements within the Highway 99 sub area. Some concern that perhaps those are a challenge to work through, as well as looking at the private road standards that currently require sidewalks on only one side of the road, and thinking if that is an appropriate street standard, particularly given where those private roads and how they might be deployed for some of this small lot single family we might be talking about, and or these middle housing developments with more smaller units, where the smaller scale could align with the smaller, narrower width of these private roads. So those were the pieces that came out, but if there are other high priority issues within this strategy, we'd certainly be looking for your feedback as well, knowing that this is mostly a code project, but with some work too that we can coordinate with Public Works. So that's what I've got, and I'm going to hand it back to Steve to talk through the next set of strategies.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Now we'll shift our, oops, this is not an updated slide. It should say funding options, I believe. So that's the next piece that we will walk through here. I'm sorry, yeah, funding options. I don't know how we got that mistake there. And as I mentioned last time, I am not an expert like Elizabeth is in her category. So I'll be introducing these, and then we'll be working together to talk them through in our small groups. So the first one we have here is existing or new local option taxes and levies. Excuse me while I scan to my notes. So this is directing project funding through grants or loans to encourage the production of income restricted affordable housing. We have one strategy identified here, revising impact fees so they're less for smaller units. That could be incentivizing certain middle housing types by waiving fees for a set time period or a certain number of applications. We would want to be thinking about how the cost of such a program could be offset as part of this discussion. I will note for this category of local taxes and levies, some information that we heard back from county staff. So House Bill 1406 funds are passed through to the Vancouver Housing Authority and are currently being used for a housing development in Battleground. So that's one category of funding. I have another note that says when House Bill 2060 was first passed in 2002, the county purchased land for housing and used the funds to pay back a 10-year bond. The county has also used some mental health sales tax dollars toward behavioral health affordable housing. There is a type of funding, if you're looking at your the document we sent out, called REET2, REET2. Clark County has enacted that funding tool, but I don't have any information about how those funds are being directed at this time. And then finally, in terms of lodging taxes, that was another local funding tool option. Clark County is currently dedicating lodging tax revenues to long-term debt obligations. So just a little bit of information there on what the county is currently doing with some of its local tax options related to, or that have the potential to contribute to affordable housing. Our next strategy type here is a local housing trust fund. That's where we have distinct funds established by a local government that receive an ongoing source of dedicated funding to support housing affordability. For some of these, we didn't create specific strategies. It's more just about the tool itself. Our next strategy type is a found land strategy, looking at surplus land and other opportunities. Donating or leasing surplus or underutilized lands to affordable housing developers to reduce the cost of development and help make a project more financially feasible. County staff informed us that there have been some inventories of available or surplus land conducted previously to look at their use for affordable housing. They found that the number of available parcels was few and of limited use. So just a note there, not that it's not a viable option, but that's kind of what's happened in past efforts to look at surplus lands. Partnering with local housing developers is our next strategy. Coordinating with local housing groups and nonprofit developers to look at property or incentives, develop housing assistance programs, working together on grant applications, code enforcement, etc. Some of what we're doing with some of our partners in the room right now. I think county staff acknowledge that they do have ongoing partnerships with many local developers, nonprofit providers, and other county departments. One area to explore is strengthening partnerships with for-profit developers of affordable housing. That was noted by county staff. E5, enhance partnerships with mission-oriented acquisition funds. So funds that are ready to go and aimed at acquiring and rehabilitating low-cost market rentals in exchange for affordability restrictions. I have a note here that the county can and has used federal HOME, H-O-M-E, funds for this purpose. So that's something that has been done in the county. E6, state or federal funding tools. There's a list of the various state and federal funding tools. HOME, which I just mentioned. A couple notes here. Clark County Community Services Department administers home and CDBG funds. Community Development administers the weatherization program. Many county affordable housing units are funded through state housing trust funds, state home funds, or national housing trust funds. And then a final note that the county also has used HUD 811 supportive housing funding and HUD 202 senior housing funding for affordable housing apartments in Clark County. These funds go directly to the developer from HUD. Did I miss anything there, Jenna? I think I got it all. Oops. So I think we're ready to go into our breakout rooms. Jenna, we had several people join during the meeting, so I'm creating 3 rooms. Elizabeth is going to take her group through categories A and then B and then E. I'm going to take my group through A and then E and then B to make sure that we cover as much as possible. And Jenna, I think we talked about you starting with A and then letting your group decide which one they want to talk about next. Are there any questions before we go into breakout groups? I'll say we have about an hour for our discussions, but do we have any questions before we go into our smaller groups?
I just have one kind of technical question going back a ways. Why is commercial under residential? Why is that recommended?
Elizabeth, do you want to field that one?
Yeah, is the question, why is it recommended or why is it not recommended?
Well, I mean, the code says, right, that you have to have commercial under residential.
Sure.
And I don't know the pros and cons of that. Why is that good or is that bad? Or
Yeah,
what's the thinking about that?
yeah, sorry, I just wanted to clarify. Are we talking about what's
Yeah.
in the code or what's being proposed? So as part of, an urban built form, certainly this idea of mix of uses and residential above commercial is a long-standing best practice, shall we say, in a jargony language. And so this idea that we could use land to get the ground floor commercial uses and then also have this, found opportunity to put housing on top of it. Great idea, gets people mixed in, active 24/7 kinds of communities where they can meet all their needs within a 20-minute walk, range of services, mix of uses. So there's that aspect, and then the other aspect has to do with the Growth Management Act and the way in which communities have to plan for their commercial and economic development needs as well as their residential needs. And so commercial lands are inventoried and are expected to account for a certain amount of economic growth, a certain number of jobs per acre of developable land, and so. I think that's part of reserving the ground floor for commercial. And so if we started talking about, any commercial site could be all a multifamily residential building with no commercial component, there could get to be some concerns that the county would fall short in meeting its GMA requirements for commercial and economic development needs. So those are probably the 2 big pieces. But so we're looking in part at is there an opportunity to add some more flexibility there, knowing that while it might be a nice ideal and a nice built form to have these vertical mixed uses, they just don't work out in all markets at all times. And so how, is there flexibility there?
Okay, thank you.
Can I jump in on that real quick? Martha, I think there's also a long-standing design tradition of window shopping, access right from the road. You pull up from your car, you park, you walk directly into a building. And I think in the context of dense development, maybe even with some historical concepts of cities of the past, it was very common to have the shop on the ground floor and people living above it. And it's a big carryover of that, even in the concept of greenfield development and how individual developments could be sectioned off and done, even the concept of having individual buildings be commercial or residential, but on the same parcel of property. The ground floor is always considered sacred in the concept of walk-in traffic.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, if there are no other questions, I just want to remind everyone that what we're trying to do is go through these strategies and really identify what the priority strategies are, considering that our charge is really to, at the end of this process, to have some actionable strategies. So I think we can think about these strategies as, which are priority strategies that can be implemented in the short term, which strategies are important, but maybe are going to take a little bit longer, a longer period of time to put into place, things that have to be calibrated or funds need to be raised, et cetera. We can include those in our report, but have them kind of in a secondary category. And then are there strategies that should be removed from consideration for any number of reasons? Feasibility, political feasibility, any number of reasons. And then our second main question is, are we missing any strategies within these different categories that we'll review? And so with that, I'm going to go ahead and open these rooms. Facilitators, please remember to hit record so that we record your conversation. And like I said, we're going to have 60 minutes. So maybe try to keep an eye on the clock as you facilitate your conversation. All right, have a good discussion, everyone. All right. So we have Victor, Martha, Heidi, Julia. I think that is the extent of our PAG members. I am going to get a new screen share up and running. Just give me 1 second. Let's see here. All right. Okay, can you all see the category A in this document here? Okay, so I know that some of you spent some time, I'm not sure how much, at our June meeting going through these, so we don't need to belabor them, but let's go ahead and get started with category A here. The first strategy type is reducing minimum lot sizes. We have a number of potential recommendations here for R1 districts, for townhouses, for duplexes, for triplexes and quadplexes, and then creating a new R1 2.5 zone for smaller units. So I guess we can talk about individual strategies, or we can just say in general, do we think that reducing minimum lot sizes is a priority strategy for us to pursue? I will note that I think this primarily targets middle housing types rather than multifamily, I would say. That's neither here nor there, just a consideration. Any thoughts on the strategy of reducing minimum lot sizes? Martha.
Well, I think it's a good one. I think we talked last time in my group about if we change zoning types, that gets people upset. But if you change the requirements within the zoning types, it's a little bit more politically feasible. So I'm learning.
No, that's
so I like this one.
Well, and I like the idea of supporting the middle housing too.
Yeah. Victor, did you have something?
Oh, I agree with Martha and Heidi that we should reduce them, and it's a good method. The neighborhood I live in, we have quite a few 20 or 2,000 square foot lots, so
Make the most of them.
mm-hmm.
Okay. Does anyone disagree that this is a good priority strategy? No. Okay. Moving on to the next one, requiring a minimum density. Current density ranges in our study area are from 1.4 to 8.7 dwelling units per acre. In low density zones, 8 to 22. In medium density zones, and 18 to 43 in high. The recommendation here is to increase minimum density in the high density zones from 47 to 60% to 60% to 80% of the maximum density. So yeah, to support multifamily residential and smaller housing units. And I think what we're trying to do here, and what we do in a lot of our work, is really make the low density zones for low density housing, medium for medium, and high for high. And sometimes we see a lot of policies that allow lower density residential in higher density zones, and we try to clean them up to make them achieve what they're designed to do. So thoughts on these increasing density in the higher density zone? Or you can give a thumbs up or a thumbs down. 2 thumbs up, 3. All right, it's unanimous. Okay, next up, increase or remove density limits. I'll skip down here to the strategy. Revise maximum density standards to align with revisions to minimum lot sizes, including greater max densities for select middle housing types, or remove maximum density for those housing types in favor of allowing minimum lot sizes to control development intensity. You can see how these might work hand in hand with minimum lot sizes, but any thoughts on maximum density standards as a tool? Thumbs up. Okay. Martha, did you have something to say?
Yeah, no, it just sounds good to me. So I think this would be fine.
Okay. Moving on to upzoning, we have a couple strategies here. I'm not going to be able to paraphrase, but exactly. But at our last meeting, Commissioner Barca did talk about how upzoning maybe was a strategy that was an alternative to some of the strategies we talked about above. That maybe you don't use them both. There's a little bit of overlap in terms of what they're trying to accomplish. But these strategies look at designating additional land for high density residential, so maybe rezoning land, designating additional land for medium density residential, and developing and applying this R1 2.5 zone for low density residential that would permit more middle housing types. And then looking at this A4.4 is looking at housing affordability metrics to track, looks like to track the what's being built. Any thoughts on upzoning? Heidi?
So Steve, I have a question as much as anything, and maybe Victor could give some information as well. So of these tools, what provides the best incentive for a developer to diversify? Because if it's easy to just keep doing the same thing you've been doing, that's really what, I mean, if I were them, that's what I would do. But which of these makes it, there's some incentive to do something different, I guess.
And are you asking for, of the kind of 4 major strategy types that we've discussed so far, minimum lot size, or are you talking about these specific strategies?
Well, these specific ones and others, but I'm just, I kind of want to keep that in the back of my mind at least.
Well, from an affordable housing standpoint, none of these. I mean, we're getting a diversity of housing types, which would be great. So I think allowing more, duplexes and triplexes on single family lots will help achieve that. I think the minimum density will require, folks. I think the issue for us is we look at a piece of land and a market rate developer snatches it up and they can pay more for it to build on it. So I think in the last meeting, I think Sirk brought it up that in the city of Vancouver, we can build affordable housing on commercially zoned lands, and that's an incentive because no market rate developer can do that. So that's, an incentive for us to get more affordable housing and get folks that might normally not build affordable housing to go that route. But then, yeah, minimum densities I think is good just to get more units on lots so folks aren't underbuilding parcels.
And Heidi, we'll definitely, when we take our break in September and take a comprehensive look at what we've heard from you all and the public before we come back with a kind of a new package of strategies. In this round, we kind of looked at all these things individually, but when we come back, I think we'll look at them comprehensively so that we're not selecting tools that overlap, that we're identifying the most efficient ways to achieve those objectives that we're looking for. Martha?
Yeah, so I'm just trying to clarify, is this in conflict with some of the other strategies, the upzoning? Or it could be,
I don't know that I'd say it's in conflict. I think it just they would potentially, if you're lowering minimum lot sizes, then that is creating more land for different housing types, right? For increased densities. So they do kind of, I don't know that you would want to do all four of them, all four of these upzoning, increasing or removing density limits, requiring minimum densities, and reducing minimum lot sizes, because they are trying to do the same thing. But we'll take a more comprehensive look at that.
But isn't upzoning more difficult to do? Changing the zone of a parcel versus
certainly politically, it certainly is, and process-wise probably too.
Yeah, so it seems like I would put that lower just because it's harder to do and gets more resistance.
Yeah.
No, I would agree.
We should probably, and we have for upzoning, for some of it, it is going to take a little bit longer and require more administrative effort. So I think we're trying to reflect that. Okay, great. A5, increase allowed housing types in existing and or proposed zones. The types are listed there. Again, this is Elizabeth's talk about we're trying to make the pie bigger, not necessarily change the flavor. So we have permitting duplexes in R1 zones, triplex and quadplex in low and medium density zones, townhouses in low density zones, courtyard apartments, internal conversions to create additional units, and then limiting single family detached uses in medium density zones. We have more, limiting townhouse uses in high density zones. Again, trying to get each type of zoning to do what it's supposed to do. And the last one here is developing a middle housing overlay for low density residential areas that allows them on smaller lots or at greater densities. So a lot of strategies here targeted to middle housing. Comments or thumbs? I got a thumbs up from Heidi.
Yeah, I like them. I think the only one that I have paused on is the overlay for middle housing.
Yeah,
it just seems like we should just allow it in all the zones, because then it's like who gets to choose where the overlay goes. And I think neighborhoods that have more say and more voice will probably advocate that they don't get the overlay. So if it's just a blanket applied to this set zone district, that seems more equitable.
That makes sense. I think the idea that Elizabeth put in here was that it would be in areas with access to transit and amenities. But I can certainly see where you're coming from, that could potentially be a problem. So noted. A6, offer density and or height incentives for desired unit types. Here we talk about offering a bonus density or height bonus for larger multifamily projects, 13 or more units in high density zones based on age, income, abilities, or based on location near transit or other amenities. Thoughts on offering those? Thumbs up from Victor, Martha, Julia. Come on, Heidi, let's hear. What's your thought there?
My only concern with that is that we're already going to very large developments and they become, if for some reason a very large development isn't well cared for or funded or whatever, they can turn into not so great developments. I've spent a fair amount of time in the New York City area, and it's, you put all of one type of housing together in one place, and it's not necessarily the best thing. I like a mixture of housing types and sizes, and anyway, so just that's my only concern.
Understood. Thank you for
Well,
sharing
and
that.
this one though talks about integrating like smaller units into a bigger building. So I think it tries to address a little bit of that, a little bit of variety.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
just
the-
worried if it gives a bonus for having, 30 units instead of a 13 unit.
Yeah.
And I mean, I get that in that, if you can accommodate that many units in that density area, you should probably do it. It's just after a while, it's like these really large developments are a little disconcerting.
Yeah.
I think this is the last one, which we talked a little bit about just a bit ago, but expanding residential uses in commercial zones. Expand options for residential uses in commercial zones. Consider permitting horizontal as well as vertical mixed use or allowing multifamily residential outright if it meets minimum densities, design standards, or serves targeted groups. And then the second one, rezone selected commercial properties for high density residential use. So a rezoning based on some sort of criteria. Good. I know we don't have Councilor Olson in the room. I think when we touched on this last time, she did mention what Elizabeth mentioned, which is the county's focus on or attention to making sure they're meeting their economic development needs as well. So I'm not 100% sure about the political feasibility of this strategy today, but we certainly, it's something that the PAG can recommend, and we'll see what happens because it is can be an important strategy.
So things are really changing in the commercial area too because of digital purchasing. So it could be interesting to see how that works. And I'm sure there's a financial impact since Clark County depends on commercial fees. So anyway, just a thought.
Victor?
I get the economic component. I think it may just be taking a closer look at, not every parcel that's zoned commercial actually makes sense to be commercial. There's a reason that there are a few vacant because it just doesn't make sense. So I think the nonprofit recently that tried to rezone a parcel that couldn't, so that they could build more affordable housing, and it's like that site would not make a great commercial pad, but they denied the zone change. So I think it's understanding the economic needs for the county, but also, putting on the business hat to see like, why hasn't this parcel actually been developed, or,
Are you aware, Victor, of, I'm just thinking, the success of this measure might depend on if we were to develop some criteria to help identify what are these commercial parcels that should be considered. Are you aware of any other cities or that have a program like that where they say, for instance, if it's vacant for more than a certain amount of time, that's probably one that should be eligible or something like that?
No, I have not in a sort of large scale. I've seen like in the urban, like downtown setting, folks have started to take that look, but not that I'm aware of.
So were you saying earlier, Victor, that we should, for these commercial lots that aren't viable, should we suggest they go to affordable housing?
That would be ideal. But yeah, even if it wasn't affordable, I think there might just be some lots throughout the community that might not be zoned correctly.
Probably, if not some sort of affordable, but multifamily, because that tends to be fit in with the commercial environment. That's where it tends to fit in well.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question, Martha?
Yeah, I would just suggest that it go to, you're saying multifamily or for affordable multifamily. Like, what's the city doing? You said, Victor, they're designating it for affordable housing, these parcels.
So yeah, in the city of Vancouver, if it's zoned commercial, you can build affordable housing on it and you don't have to pick ground floor commercial in the development, which really helps because affordable housing developers aren't really great at managing commercial developments. And so it just makes it easier and it's more competitive, or it's an incentive for us to develop affordable housing because it's something that market rate developers can't do, because we have to set them at a certain AMI level. I think it's 50% AMI for a certain period of time in order to get that change or to do affordable housing on the commercial lot.
I'd like to see that in the county too, if that's a possibility.
Okay. Yeah, so again, having some criteria around when this tool is used might make it more politically feasible. All right, well, thanks for that discussion. I'm now gonna shift gears and have us talk about funding options. The first one is just using local option taxes and levies. This document identified a number of these. Local housing property tax levy, which I think is the one that is currently being used for this development in Battleground. Housing and related services tax, this real estate excise tax, lodging taxes. I don't think I heard that the county's using general funds for this purpose, or and then we know that tax increment financing, it was just made, I believe, available to counties as a new tool to use. So the county hasn't used it to date. But how do we feel about the idea of the county using these different potential local taxing tools to generate funds for affordable housing? I see 2 thumbs up, 3. Julia? Okay. Clearly, while some of these they're are designed so it's not necessarily a cost to the city, there are some, if you were to take money from your general fund, it would be a cost to the city, which is why we identify a higher price tag on this one. So that's just something to keep in mind. I know as we go along, there was one tool, I can't remember which, I'll talk about it when we get there, but there's some tools that county staff said, well, if we're gonna kind of give up funding in this one area, we might want to think about, what that means for the services we provide or what the impacts might be and how we can mitigate that.
Is the TIF new? Because I thought Washington didn't allow TIF.
I think it's brand new. If I remember correctly, I think this is a tool that just passed in this legislative session. I can double check on that, but that's my recollection, that this tool just became available to counties, but I might be wrong about that. Let me double check. I'll take another look at that. The second tool is developing a local housing trust fund. I'd be interested to hear if that's a conversation that any of you are aware of, if the counties have that conversation about the idea of putting together a local housing trust fund with money from different, variety of sources. No, I mean, I know some, go ahead.
I just say this one seems harder to me, and I'm looking at the cost and the administrative effort. I'm not sure it's worth what it would take to put it together.
I know there are local housing trust funds in different jurisdictions in Oregon, and I think it's almost like a combination of number one and number two. It's taking some of those taxing opportunities and dedicating some of the funds that come for that into this affordable housing fund, and then someone's got to manage it. You have to create rules about how the funds are going to be used. So it's not insignificant effort, as we show here, but it can be an important tool, I think. Any other comments on a local housing trust fund?
wouldn't get rid of it, but I do agree that it's probably low on the, or it's high on the totem pole. High to achieve, won't be easily achievable. I think there are other tools that they already implement that could just be revamped if you wanted to increase the amount of funding in those pools.
Okay. So you feel like this almost seems like a something extra that maybe doesn't need to be done because the money's already there. It's just in different pots.
Mhm.
It seems like it, or it seems like, is it just sort of like a extra levy, like the Affordable Housing Fund?
It could be that too. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay.
I just pulled up a website that says on May 10th, 2021, Governor Inslee signed a bill completing a bipartisan legislative effort to grant new powers of tax increment financing to the state's cities, counties, and port districts. So that's as far as I read, but that's what my recollection is. Our next category, E3, is looking at surplus land and on other publicly owned land to potentially be developed as affordable housing. I mentioned that in our conversation or in the review from county staff. They said they have looked at this in the past, and the suitability for affordable housing, the lots that were identified through the inventory weren't very suitable, and they were, so I think there it says few and of limited use. That certainly doesn't mean that there might not be opportunities going forward. What do people think about this strategy of the county using surplus land? And here it's defined as, brownfields, adaptive reuse. It could be school district land or church land. So what do we think about this strategy of using surplus land for affordable housing? Thumbs up from Julia and Victor.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings. It sounds like, I mean, it's kind of lower priority for me because it sounds like it could be minimal results. But why are like church lots included in this?
I'm not sure that this is from the Department of Commerce description of the tool. They might just be thinking about public or kind of quasi, church.
It seems like churches.
What's that?
There might be other provisions so churches and service groups can develop their own land.
Yeah, we certainly talked about some other provisions related to church-owned land at our last meeting when we were talking about affordable housing incentives. But sometimes building affordable housing would meet the mission of a church, but they might not want to do the work themselves, so they could donate.
Oh, so they give it to the. Okay, yeah. I see what you're saying.
I think that would probably be the same with school district-owned land. School districts don't have a ton of land that they can just give away because it's usually purchased with bonds, and so that's not an insignificant effort, but it's possible.
So it seems like the effort might be worthwhile just to go through the parcels that are in this section of the county and see if there's something that comes out of it, but it's not, I mean, it sounds like it's like a piece of work that you just go through every parcel and do some criteria and see what you come up with. But it doesn't sound like the answer to, affordable housing.
Going to solve all the problems. I would think it would be a relatively simple GIS, analysis exercise that could be done on some sort of regular basis just to see what's in the inventory.
Yeah, we've done this a few times with Vancouver Public Schools. They surplus land to us, and I think it's on here because it's for tax purposes. It's not a gift, because then. So I think if it's that, like school, I think that's why churches are on here as well.
Gotcha. That makes sense. Okay, so not a priority, but a top priority, but a strategy that's worth pursuing. E4, this is a little bit different kind of a strategy because it's not very, we don't have a specific strategy listed right now, but in general, partnering for the county to partner with local housing providers. And it gives a number of different ways that can happen, whether it's, like we said, identifying property or pursuing grant funds together or looking at property owner assistance or other programs. Good strategy. Wondering how much is that being, does anyone have any specific, like, oh, here's one area where I really think the county should be partnering with housing providers. Like, here's something that's not happening right now that would be a really good way for the county to work with housing providers?
Victor, why don't you answer that one?
Right. So like for us, we have a really great relationship with the county and their community development department. So no complaints on that end from the funding side. I mean, more is always better. So of course we'll take more money. But then I think, all I can think of is expediting, the process for permitting and things like that come to mind. I don't know if that's probably not in this category technically, but that comes to mind. The only other thing I can think of is purchasing land when it comes available, because for a lot of nonprofits, they don't have the resources to, buy a piece of land when it becomes available. So if the county could land bank.
Sure, those are great. I know we do have, I think in August, we'll be talking about administrative strategies like streamlining permitting process, but those are both good suggestions. Okay, E5, enhancing partnerships with mission-oriented acquisition funds.
Do we want to go back just a second to the thing about strengthening partnerships with for-profit developers of affordable housing?
Yeah.
I don't know enough about that to have a real opinion, but maybe Victor or somebody else does.
Well, I know
is that a good thing?
We do have Phil on our PAG, and I can't remember, I'm drawing a blank on his company's name, but he's a for-profit developer. I don't know if you'd consider it affordable housing, but what's the company name, Victor?
Gen Group.
Gen.
Oh, yeah.
We've partnered with them. We have a project under construction with them right now, actually.
Oh, great.
So for-profit developer, but they have a mission-driven sort of component to them. So we've worked with them, or we're in conversations on future projects. So they are a great example of this. I don't know of any other.
Well, is Wolfgang the one that does the tiny homes?
Wolf too, yes, we're also working with them.
Oh, great, 2 examples.
Okay.
So this could be one that's already, we can talk about progress. That's something that's already happening. Anything else on this one, Martha?
Okay, no, that's it. Thank you.
Great. Enhancing partnerships with mission-oriented acquisition funds. So looking at capital for rehabilitating low-cost market rentals in exchange for affordability restrictions. So kind of converting existing units into affordable units. And it says that the county staff noted that the county has used federal home funds for this purpose. Any thoughts on this strategy and its viability? Lukewarm?
So would this be, I'm thinking of like ramp programs or programs where for low income individuals that own their homes, they can get a grant, like, if their water heater goes out, or is that sort of in this category?
That's a good question. I think we have that in like home rehabilitation funds in our affordable housing incentives category. But I can make sure that type of program shows up somewhere, and we'll probably be combining these 2 categories when we revisit these again. There's some artificial divisions between them. It seems like this one is pretty much focused on finding market rate rentals that maybe need rehabilitation, and then so probably working directly with like apartment complex owners.
Gotcha.
But we can make sure we can if we don't have it somewhere else, we can definitely look at what similar programs for individual homeowners. Martha?
I was just saying this looks like it's a lower priority for me. It just takes more money, and I don't think it's going to result in a huge increase of affordable housing. So it's probably lower priority.
Okay. The final tool in this category is state or federal funding tools. We kind of walked through a different list of these things. It seems to me, and I might be mistaken here, again, not my area of expertise, but that if you're getting state or federal or regional funds, that the impact on the city's budget isn't quite as great as when you're implementing those local taxes and fees. But I don't see, yeah, I'd be interested to hear from you all if there's any drawbacks to pursuing this category of state and federal funding sources.
I think the county should just support it. So if there's ever, measures, I think right now they're going through the process. There's bills at the federal level to increase the amount of tax credit. So, if the county can be a champion to say, yes, we want this to help our community. Same, the land acquisition program at the state is oversubscribed. So just being an advocate is probably where the county falls into play on a lot of these programs. And writing letters of support when we have applications, because we apply to all of these to build affordable housing.
Okay. Anything else on this one? All right. You can close your eyes while I scroll all the way back up to the top of this page. Our final category, switching now, you had your brain in regulatory, and then we went to funding. Now switch it back to regulatory. We'll go through the topics that Elizabeth just talked about today. Number one, reducing off-street parking requirements. She talked about a number of different ways that this could be done. I think we also touched on parking from a different angle in category A, maybe. But in any case, what do we think about reducing off-street parking requirements in general? And then if there are any of these specific approaches, if there's one that's favored over the others.
Well, it seems like it's a good idea to me if we can reduce these requirements and still, meet people's need.
I think there's definitely a more of a political concern, people not liking to see more cars parked on the street, or the perception of a lack of parking is often what we see. So I think that's the real challenge here, kind of what's the right balance of, trying to reduce parking so more of the lot is available for actual housing development, and balancing that with, community perceptions or desires around parking.
Wonder if people just got smaller cars, can we mandate that? Look at these big pickup trucks that my neighbor has. I go, you could get 2 little cars in that parking spot.
Yeah, I don't know. I don't think that's going to fly.
I'm not going to work. Sorry.
Is it tied at all with the ability to get around? I mean, transit, etc. I mean, that's the hard part, is nobody really wants to develop transit over here either, other than buses. So if there's no other way to get around, it's difficult to do.
So we certainly can be looking at, targeting these to areas where there's good walkability to services, or on transit lines or transportation corridors. That certainly can be something that it's tied to.
Well, and didn't I just read C-Tran was doing something where they have more like more of a Uber-like service where you can, it'll be easier to get transportation in places that aren't served by buses. I just remember an article I read something like that. I didn't totally understand it, but that might make a difference too if we had these other services that would provide.
Yeah, certainly they talk about how the first mile and the last mile or something like that, the beginning and end of transit trips are the hardest. Once you get to the majority of the trip is easy. It's the beginning and the end that's hard. Heidi?
Oh, I just, they have C-Van, which is for those who have some disabilities potentially, that you can do a one-on-one trip, but I hadn't heard about that, Martha. It'd be interesting to hear. What else they have.
But and I don't know if it was just for people with mobility issues or if it was going to be for everyone, but it's kind of the sense of serving some of these places that don't have buses. If not, it'd be a good idea. Maybe I dreamt it.
Okay. Any other thoughts on these strategies in general?
No, I think just for that, when we say senior housing, that we also include folks with like behavioral health challenges, or assisted living doesn't mean that folks are actually over 55. So maybe just a broader definition of what would qualify for some of these reductions.
Okay, got
Yeah,
it. Great.
I don't know if it talks about limited mobility. I think of, people with developmental disabilities. Many of them too aren't going to be driving.
I know last month, Kate Budd was in the group that I was facilitating, and she talked about some of their specific housing developments that are targeted to specific populations. Again, like you said, of people who don't drive might be candidates as well. So again, probably comes down to calibrating this tool to those developments that can most benefit from it and have the least impacts on the surrounding community. B2, revise ground floor commercial requirements for mixed use development. So this is a little bit different flavor of what we talked about earlier. Elizabeth put together several strategies of looking at those ground floor commercial uses and being more flexible there, whether it's a community room or a lobby or a plaza instead of actual commercial activity. Permitting horizontal configurations of commercial and residential space, exploring options to increase access to neighborhood scale retail and service uses. Let's see, I think that's it. So
Is there a problem with having actual apartments on the first floor instead of common spaces? I didn't quite understand that either.
yeah, I think Elizabeth and Ron kind of tried to summarize this. I think Ron was basically saying there's a historical preference for building design that allows for, window shopping. You're trying to create like a commercial strip that's going to interest people, having some sort of active use on the ground floor and not just a private residence.
Yeah.
Is a big part of that, I think.
But I also think someplace I was in Portland recently where they had apartments on the ground floor. You could see, what they were doing, but they were there. And it was a fairly busy sidewalk, I thought.
Yeah.
So I don't even have problems, if people want to live there, having apartments on the first floor rather than just a community room.
How do people feel in general about this strategy of kind of being more flexible around ground floor commercial requirements?
I support it. I think I can't tell what the entire ground floor need to be active space. Or could you have a portion of it be residential? Is that, or are we not in that deep in the weeds?
I think not that deep in the weeds, but that's
Okay.
a perfect comment for today in terms of that's something that we should explore, because that'll help us when we take another look at these in September.
Gotcha.
Yeah, I like the flexibility, so it's not a one size fits all.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Next up, simplifying design standards. There's 3 strategies here that Elizabeth put together. One is looking at the Highway 99 approach and trying to reduce complexity while promoting the desired form. Second is revising cottage housing standards to provide more feasibility, looking at increasing allowed density, permitting a greater variety of attached or detached units, et cetera. So I think that's looking at the existing, what's allowed for cottages and trying to make that a little more flexible. And then revising open space and recreation area requirements for larger multifamily projects to reduce competition for site area on high density projects. And I think Elizabeth, that I remember her slide in particular during her presentation a few months ago, showing how those open space requirements can really impact what you can get done on a site. So how do we feel about these strategies? Simplifying design standards.
Sound good to me.
Good to Julia, good to Victor. Heidi.
Yeah, I just have one comment on the open space piece of things. Just what happens is you have high density after high density after high density, unless you have a park that's by the county or someone else, then it's difficult if you get rid of the open space. So I'm just, as long as there's something that fills in the void.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And I think that's why in this case, Elizabeth's suggestion says exempt units over the minimum density or over 30 units per acre. So once you incorporate your open space requirements until you hit a certain point, and then over that point, you probably don't need to continue to increase the amount of park space. I think that kind of gets to what you're saying. It's not eliminating it altogether, but it's saying, okay, when is enough for a development? Great. Revising accessory dwelling unit standards. So we know that the county's already passed ADU standards, and there's a couple of recommendations here about ways that those could be modified to allow more development to happen. Whether it's allowing more than one ADU on a property, or removing minimum unit sizes, or permitting them in different zones. How do we feel about accessory dwelling units and trying to make those a more prevalent housing option? Heidi, thinking about it.
Do we need a minimum size? How small can they be and still be livable?
Yeah, I don't have an answer to that question.
Yeah, I've tried to Google it a little bit. I mean, 150 seems a little bit standard, but yeah, I'm just wondering how small you want to go.
Just to have your very basic needs in there. Yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, well, I think we have mostly support here. That's fine. B5, manufactured home and tiny house communities. So I think protecting existing manufactured home parks from displacement is something that's used in jurisdictions around the country. Exploring potential for RVs and tiny homes to provide lower cost residential opportunities. Those are the two. How do we feel about these two strategies? Thumbs up from Julia.
Yeah.
And Martha. Everybody. Okay. Great.
So I get a little confused again. I think you've talked about this before, the difference between mobile and manufactured homes.
Yeah, I think mobile just means they have wheels
On them.
Yeah.
So what? And there's been a lot of raising the rent. Is that on manufactured homes? On the land for those?
Go ahead, Victor.
Yeah, I think a lot of folks have been increasing the, I guess, what is it, the fee that you pay to have your home
To lease your
Mhm.
lot.
Yeah.
Seems like there needs to be something to do. Yeah, to protect people from getting priced out,
It's the
which
public.
is what they do to clear them out.
Are folks allowed to speak if they're in the public or no?
Yeah, I'd ask that our members of the public hold their comments until the public comment period, and that's the appropriate time. But thank you, because we only have a few minutes left. We are. Thank you, Santo. We're on our last category here. This is, oops, I go the wrong way. Transportation improvement standards. So revisiting cross circulation requirements within the Highway 99 sub area. Yeah, I'm not educated on that. I barely heard what Elizabeth was saying about it, so I can't speak to that intelligently. Revisit private road standards requiring sidewalks on only one side of the road to determine if these meet pedestrian needs while providing site and design flexibility.
Are they saying we don't need sidewalks at all then?
I think what they're saying is, it seems to me that right now their sidewalks are only required on one side of the street, which does provide some flexibility for developers, but are those negatively impacting pedestrian needs? If you only have the sidewalk on one side of the street. So I think it says to look into the balance there of those two things. Unless someone has a different take on what that means. Because, if you don't have sidewalks and then your right of way is potentially smaller and there's more land to develop.
Mm-hmm.
But not having sidewalks on both sides of the street can be an issue for pedestrians and people with disabilities and thoughts on these transportation related strategies? Maybe not a high priority. Go ahead,
Well,
Heidi.
it seems like they're actually in the opposite direction. So if you make transportation improvement more strict so that there's sidewalks on both sides and all that kind of stuff, then it's actually the opposite direction. It would be more expensive to develop there. So I'm not quite sure how this relates to what we're talking about. I mean, I don't disagree that it may be an issue for, you know, they put this Highway 99 thing together, and maybe it is an issue, but it seems like it's cross purposes to what we've been trying to do.
Yeah.
I agree. I was like, all of these things seem like it would make development more expensive.
Okay.
But it seems like if you pedestrian friendly, then you might need less cars.
So
Okay.
is the goal then, it seems like the goal would then be that, is there a way for the county to provide funding to cover these necessary improvements? Is that the request? Or the
Yeah,
objective?
alternative access and facility design standards developed in consultation with public works and fire officials can create flexibility and or lower costs for new residential development. So I think that's what we're trying to do. Whether or not the two strategies listed fall within that definition, we can revisit with Elizabeth, I think. Okay. I haven't got a timer yet, but I think we're pretty close to running through our time. But that is, we made it through all of them. Congratulations. Nice work, everybody. Any questions or comments or things that we want to discuss with the time we have left? And if not, I think we can probably, do you guys have a button that allows you to return to the main room? I'm getting yeses and nos.
Do we want to hear comments from Santo? Do we have time for that?
Sure, we could do that. We've got time. Santo, please share your comment. Thank you, Martha. Good idea.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Mhm.
Okay, so I live in a manufactured home community up here. And like you were talking about before, you know, they raise the rents on these places. We own the house, but they raise the rent. And a lot of these owners feel that it's their own private piggy bank. They're not giving us much back in return for amenities. Like our owner here, he paves a few sections of the park every year or two, but never the whole park, and doesn't address the problem areas that need to be paved. Part of the problem is, so last year, Governor Inslee had the moratorium on rent increases. So he was going to raise the rent. He put that in his, the leases that he sent out, did not raise the rent, did not collect higher rent, but then put it on the back end of collecting higher rent this year. So in a 2-year span, our rents went up about $100 a month. And I feel like I'm paying for a glorified parking space. So it's not even just a question of being affordable. It's a question of the rents pricing senior citizens like me and people that are on fixed incomes out of the market. And these parks are not protected. I saw in there, because I read your agenda notes about the manufactured home park designations. That's very important because it makes it harder for owners to turn around, sell a park, a developer to come in, and because of the way it's zoned, with just a permit application, he can turn it into a condo development. So that's the dilemma there.
Yeah.
I am actually moving because I know that this is going to increase over and over again. And I'm using the equity that I built up in the house that I do own. And we're moving into a brand new apartment complex. It's costing me a little bit more money, but it's based on principle. So, but I'm still working with one of my neighbors, and we're going to try to follow these meetings and make some inroads as to what goes on. I would love to be on the board, but That's not possible this year, but I would continue along that vein to get involved. So,
Thank you.
Yeah, so that's why I was wondering if there's, I don't know if the county can do this. Can they limit rent increases? That would be rent control maybe on the land.
Yeah, that's a tricky one. I don't know as much about that. We can certainly talk about it, but I think in terms of developing a manufactured home park zone and regulations to protect existing manufactured home parks from displacement, that's something that's definitely doable, and that's what our strategy is here. And I heard support from everyone for that strategy. So
one of the questions, if I can interject, we don't have any control to know what the owners of these parks, what their expenses are. If we knew that, what his balance sheet showed us, that does he really need to increase the rents? I mean, we had the moratorium last year. He was set to increase it, didn't increase it. He didn't really need that money, obviously. So why did he have to go ahead and tack it onto the back end of this year's increase? Why? And it's like, and for the amount that he's increasing it, that's way over the top as far as a rent increase should be. But just my feelings on it.
Yep, understood, Santo. Thanks for raising this issue, and we'll at least explore if there are any options around rent increases. I think, like I said, what we can probably more readily do is look at stopping displacement from happening, or what you talked about, someone coming in, buying a manufactured home park, moving and redeveloping it essentially. So, but we'll take a look at issues around fees and rent as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, you might need a tenants' rights group to assist on that.
Are there any resources that you can recommend, Victor? Do you know of?
Ooh, not off the top of my head, but I could definitely find out soon.
Okay. Okay, well, I think it's time to go back to our main room. For those who have a button that says return to the main room, can you share where that button is so everyone can benefit from that?
I have leave room in the right-hand bottom of my screen. I don't know where it takes me. I
Okay.
up to the main room.
Okay, well, let's go ahead and leave this room. I'm going to jump into the other rooms and let them know. I think I scheduled the timing a little bit too long, so I'll see you all in a minute. All right, I just sent a note to the other rooms asking them to return at 4:45. So we'll reconvene in about 2 minutes. Okay, everyone's got 30 seconds to return, so we'll get going in just a little bit here. Okay. It looks like everyone is back or in the process of returning. I accidentally scheduled those meetings for about 10 minutes longer than they should have been. So we're thus behind on our agenda. I apologize, but I don't think it's too big of a problem. Let's just do a quick report back, maybe on 1 to 3 key ideas that each group seemed to gravitate towards the most. And Elizabeth, could we start with you?
Sure thing, Steve. So my group talked a lot about the regulatory strategies, both going back over A and then into B. So certainly we're interested in some changes to commercial, the requirements in the commercial zones, but then extending sort of the mirror image of that to both to compensate, but also just to add vitality to neighborhoods by integrating those neighborhood commercials into residential areas. So if more residential is in commercial, then more commercial could be permitted in residential as well. So ways to make that work, but also recognizing that, you know, prevailing market patterns have been a little bit different for the last 10 years. And so there've been some challenges getting those developed. But I would say overall, we had a really interesting conversation about how can we change some of the paradigms that we're working in. So we thought about that also in terms of parking, about how could we use things like transit? How could we think about things like car sharing, pooled resources as ways to build towards the future and create some opportunities in the code, as well as modifying options for today for the different housing types we're trying to build. And let's see, also just talked a lot about what cottages could be like and how making development smaller scale could meet a variety of different needs, both in making homeownership affordable on small scales, also meeting needs of some of our aging in place for some of our older residents in the community, and ways to keep all the amenities and quality of life, but in a different size and more intelligently configured package, rather than just adding endless square footage that is poorly designed. So that's some of the bigger trends that we talked about, but good conversation.
Great, thank you. Jenna.
All right, we had a lot of good feedback. A few things that are top of mind from all of the things we talked about. I think there was an interest in reviewing, you know, a lot of the code and development standards around things like Highway 99, where we maybe have different standards for some types of residential development compared to the standard code. And, you know, how can we simplify there? And I think sort of there's an overarching theme of how do we increase flexibility, but also make sure we're really clear on where the boundaries are for a lot of the stuff that we talked about. But that's this idea of revisiting some of the code language around cottage housing and ADUs to see if there is any other flexibility we can build in while still, you know, not causing a lot of unintended consequences. Also had some discussion about partnerships, you know, with private development community, with faith-based community. I think that came up when we were talking about things like surplus land, and that, or even just testing out some of these ideas, that there's an opportunity to build those relationships and maybe find some new opportunities that way. And then I think one of the things that stood out to me when we revisited the category A topic was, again, I think some interest in smaller lot options, you know, and that came up in a variety of different ways, but a way to be able to provide that. So there was a lot more discussed, so that's only skimming the surface.
Yes, and of course, that'll be reflected in the summary we put together. I'll add from group one, our group, I think in general, a lot of support for the various strategies. I think most of them in category A, but wanting to understand, and I mentioned to my group that when we come back in October, we at this point in time, we've looked at each of these strategies or types individually, but when we come back, we'll want to be looking at things more holistically to make sure that different strategies aren't counteracting one another or trying to achieve the same thing just from different angles. We'll make sure it's a little more comprehensive. In category B, I think there was some hesitancy around reducing off-street parking requirements and maybe things around density bonuses and things of that, but just wanting, or even residential and commercial zones, but more around just wanting to make sure that it's calibrated correctly, that I think several of those strategies mention identifying criteria. So when are these tools appropriate and in what locations, and just being thoughtful about the specifics of those. Also in category B, we talked a lot at the end about manufactured home parks and definitely the importance of protecting those existing parks from displacement. There was also some concern about rent increases. I don't know if that's within our guideposts here, if that's something we can do something about, but that issue was raised as well. But I think the 5.1 really looking at protecting manufactured home parks from displacement is a priority. And then in the funding options, I mean, I think we learned that the county is using a lot of different funds and different pools of funds, and working with nonprofit and for-profit partners to some degree. There's a role for the county to be an advocate, if nothing else, in some of these, looking for state and federal funding, and working with those partners. So I think maybe not as high a priority as some of the regulatory changes people would like to see, but certainly all worthy, or at least most of them worthy strategies that should be considered going forward. Well, thanks everyone. I for one really enjoyed having plenty of time to talk through all these different strategies with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here again, and we will move to our public comment period. So for those members of the public who are with us, I ask if you're interested in providing some public comment that you raise your hand, and then I'll call on you. We can unmute you and turn off your video if you like or not. And we'd like to hear your comment and limit it to about 2 minutes. So do we have any members of the public that would like to provide comment? And usually the raise hand, it depends on your version of Zoom. Sometimes it's in reactions. Sometimes it's in the participants panel. I am not seeing any hands raised at this time. Give it 30 more seconds. Okay. All right, looks like no comments from the public for today. So we did have one member of the public at the end of our group discussion share his comments about manufactured housing, which kind of spurred our further discussion of that topic. So I'll make sure that's reflected in the meeting summary. Okay, well, that takes us to next steps. We are still in this develop recommendations phase through August. Again, we'll switch ahead here, click ahead here. Our next meeting is August 24th. We'll be sending out a list of our last categories of strategies to consider. I know in partnership with county staff, we still need to make some revisions to those and package those up, but we'll get those to you at least a week before that meeting. And then again, no meeting in September. So everybody gets September off, and then we'll reconvene in October with hopefully a refined and more comprehensive look at all the different strategies that we've been discussing. So I just want to take a minute to say thanks, everyone. I know this is the time of year, like Jenna said, that it gets harder to attend meetings, especially at the end of the day. So we appreciate what I'm sure was a great discussion in all three groups, and look forward to seeing you again in August. Jenna, do you have anything to add to close us out?
Nope.
All right. Have a good evening, everyone. Thanks again.